You wake up, check your phone, scroll through TikTok for 20 minutes, drag yourself out of bed, throw on some clothes, microwave something for breakfast, another day, another dollar. Now imagine this. It's 40,000 years ago. No phone, no microwave, no bed. Just you, the earth, and survival. But here's what's going to mess with your head. That caveman you're picturing grunting and dragging a club, he never existed. The real story is so much wilder, so much more incredible, that it's going to completely change how you see human history, and honestly, yourself. Before we get into it, if you're vibing with these videos, go ahead and hit subscribe. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Last video had people from Tokyo, Toronto, and Tallahassee. The internet's insane, right? Everything you think you know about cavemen is a lie. The dim-witted brutes living in dark caves, barely surviving. Complete fantasy. The truth? These people were operating on a level that would put most of us to shame. Let me introduce you to someone. We'll call him Grok. Yeah, I know, not his real name, but we'll never know what he actually called himself. Grok lived about 35,000 years ago in what we now call France. He's 27 years old, which makes him pretty experienced by his community standards, and his morning routine is about to completely shatter everything you've been taught. The sun isn't even up yet, but Grok is awake, not because some artificial alarm shocked him out of deep sleep, not because he's anxious about some meeting. His body just naturally transitioned from sleep to wakefulness as the temperature shifted. His internal clock is perfectly synced with the natural world in a way that would make modern sleep doctors weep with envy. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Scientists studied modern hunter-gatherer societies to understand how prehistoric people slept. What they discovered is crazy. These people sleep better than anyone in the modern world. They fall asleep naturally about 3 hours after sunset. They wake up naturally about an hour before sunrise. And here's the kicker. In one study of 94 people living traditional lifestyles, researchers found almost no instances of nighttime waking. The language didn't even have a word for insomnia. Meanwhile, more than half of modern Americans report regular sleep problems. We've completely lost something they had figured out, but back to Grok. He's lying on what you'd probably call a bed, and it would surprise you. This isn't just animal skins thrown on dirt, it's a carefully engineered sleeping surface, layers of dried grass for insulation, processed hides for comfort and warmth, pine needles and feathers for cushioning. This setup is more comfortable than most camping gear you can buy today, and he's not sleeping alone in some isolated corner. The whole family sleeps together, parents, kids, sometimes extended family, not because they lack space. This is intentional. Modern sleep research has proven that people who sleep near family members have better sleep quality, lower stress, and stronger emotional bonds. Cavemen knew this 35,000 years ago. Grok quietly stands up, careful not to disturb anyone. First thing he does? Check the fire. But this isn't like checking your phone. This is life and death. The fire isn't what you're imagining, not some crackling campfire from a movie. This is sophisticated technology, multiple fires actually, each one serves a specific purpose. There's the main fire in the center for warmth and general cooking, a smaller, hotter fire for specialized tasks like tool making or heating stones. a smoky fire near the entrance for insect control, and usually a backup fire that smoulders slowly, able to burn for hours without attention. Grok can tell just by looking whether each fire needs more fuel, different wood, or better airflow. The color of the flames, the smell of the smoke, the sound of the burning. He's reading these fires like you read a dashboard, and he's adding specific types of wood to each fire. Hardwood for long-lasting heat, softwood for quick flames, aromatic woods for pleasant smells and medicinal smoke. Every choice is based on knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. Next, Grok steps outside to check the weather, but he's not pulling out a phone. He's reading the environment like a book written specifically for him. Wind direction and strength, cloud formations and colors, how the air smells and tastes, animal sounds and behaviors. The way plants are moving. He's processing dozens of data points simultaneously to predict not just today's weather, but conditions for the next several days. This information determines everything. What activities are possible today? Whether the group needs to relocate, what food sources will be available, whether they need to prepare for storms. Modern meteorologists with satellites and supercomputers get 5-day forecasts right about 65% of the time. Grok, using only his senses and accumulated knowledge, was probably more accurate. While he's outside, he's also doing a security check, looking for predator tracks from the night, signs that other human groups have been nearby, evidence of animals that might be hunted today, changes in the local water sources. This isn't paranoia, this is survival intelligence. His family's continued existence depends on knowing about threats and opportunities within a several-mile radius. By the time he comes back inside, others are waking up. But there's no chaos, no rushing around trying to get ready for work. Everything flows naturally based on what the day requires and what the environment is telling them. His partner, we'll call her Vera, is already mentally planning the day. She's an expert in her own right. She knows more about plant identification, food preparation, hide processing, and medicine than most modern people know about anything. She's checking food stores, considering what today's activities will require nutritionally, planning meals that will provide the right energy at the right times. This isn't just grabbing whatever. This is sophisticated nutritional planning. Their breakfast is probably healthier than what most modern people eat. Wild game for protein. Nuts and seeds for healthy fats. Berries and fruits for vitamins and quick energy. Root vegetables for complex carbohydrates. Everything fresh, organic and locally sourced because there's literally no other option. They're also drinking herbal teas, not for Instagram photos, for specific health benefits. Some plants provide energy, some aid digestion, some support immune function. Vera knows dozens of medicinal plants and uses them preventively. The kids aren't just sitting around being fed. The 7-year-old is already helping manage the fires. The 10-year-old is inspecting tools and equipment. These aren't child laborers being exploited. These are young people learning survival skills by participating in real activities with real consequences. They're not memorizing abstract information they'll never use. They're developing practical expertise that directly impacts their future success. By age 10, these children can create fire, identify edible and poisonous plants, track animals, make simple tools, and navigate using natural landmarks. They have more practical skills than most modern college graduates. After breakfast, the family discusses plans. This isn't top-down decision-making, it's collaborative consultation where everyone's observations and expertise matter. Grok might have noticed animal tracks suggesting hunting opportunities. Vera might have identified plants ready for harvest. The kids might have observed weather patterns or interesting features during yesterday's explorations. Decisions are made collectively based on all available information. Today, they've decided on a hunting expedition. Not because they're desperate for food, but because they've identified optimal conditions, animal migrations, weather patterns, available time, group readiness. Everything aligns. This decision involves complex planning, what weapons to bring, what route to take, how to coordinate with other families, what backup plans to have. Modern project managers would recognize this as sophisticated logistics, but Grok and his people make it look effortless because they've optimized every aspect through generations of experience. Their hunting equipment is carefully selected, spears with precisely crafted points, atlatls that extend throwing range by 300%, knives for processing, kills rope made from plant fibers, fire-starting kits. Each item is engineered for maximum effectiveness with minimum weight. The route planning is equally sophisticated. Grok knows the terrain for hundreds of miles, water sources, animal migration paths, dangerous areas to avoid, safe camping spots. He's carrying a mental map more detailed than any GPS database. They also have contingency plans. If the primary hunting ground is occupied by predators, they have alternative locations. If weather changes unexpectedly, they have shelter options. If the target animals aren't where predicted, they have backup strategies. This level of planning rivals what modern expedition leaders do with teams and technology. The actual hunt is like watching a perfectly choreographed performance. Everyone knows their role. Every movement has purpose. There's no wasted energy or duplicated effort. Grok and two other experienced hunters take the primary pursuit positions. Vera and other skilled trackers cover flanking positions. Younger members control escape routes. Each person has trained for years to execute their role perfectly. But they're not mindlessly following a script. They're adapting in real time to changing conditions, animal behavior, wind shifts, terrain features, unexpected obstacles. They communicate through hand signals and subtle sounds. Complex information transmitted silently, direction changes, distance estimates, tactical adjustments. They've developed a complete non-verbal language for hunting coordination, and they're reading the environment constantly. Fresh tracks tell them exactly how many animals, how recently they passed, how fast they were moving, whether they were alert or relaxed. Broken vegetation indicates direction and urgency. Scent patterns reveal proximity and wind direction. They're processing more environmental data than most modern people notice in a week. When they spot their target, a group of reindeer, everything shifts. Heart rates stay controlled. Movements become even more precise. Focus narrows. This is what they've trained for since childhood. The approach takes hours, slowly, patiently closing distance, working with terrain and wind, never rushing, never losing focus. Modern special forces operators train for years to achieve this level of tactical patience. Cavemen developed it as a basic life skill. When they finally strike, it's devastatingly effective. multiple spears thrown simultaneously from optimal positions. The targeted reindeer drops almost instantly. The others scatter, but they were never in danger. This group only takes what they need. But the work isn't done. Now comes processing, and this is where their expertise really shows. They're field dressing the animal with precision that would impress modern surgeons. Every cut is intentional, every movement efficient. Nothing is wasted. The meat is carefully sectioned for transport and preservation. The hide is removed without damage for future use. Organs are collected, some for immediate eating, others for specific purposes. The bones are saved for tool making, the sinew for cordage. Even the brain will be used in hide processing. They're extracting maximum value from every part, and they're doing it quickly. Predators are attracted to blood. Other human groups might be watching. Speed matters, but so does quality. Each step is performed with practiced skill that comes from thousands of repetitions while working their teaching. The younger members are watching, asking questions, practicing on smaller portions. This is education. Direct transmission of complex skills from expert to novice. No textbooks, no classrooms. Just human knowledge transfer in its purest form. By late afternoon, they're heading back to camp, but they're not just walking, they're still gathering information, noting plant locations, observing animal behavior, updating their mental maps. Every journey serves multiple purposes. Back at camp, the whole community celebrates, not because they got lucky, because skilled people executed a successful plan. The celebration includes everyone, those who hunted and those who maintained camp, elders who provided guidance and children who are learning. This is community bonding, social cohesion that makes survival possible. The meat is distributed according to complex social protocols. Hunters get first choice, but everyone receives a share. Elders are respected, children are fed, no one goes hungry when the community has food. This isn't naive communism. This is sophisticated social technology that ensures group survival and maintains cooperation. Evening brings different activities. Some people are processing the day's kill, smoking meat for preservation, scraping and treating hides, sorting bones for tool making. Others are maintaining equipment, sharpening spear points, repairing clothing, crafting new tools. Some are gathering firewood. Others are preparing meals. Everyone contributes according to their skills and the group's needs, but it's not all work. There's socializing, storytelling, music, games, children playing and learning simultaneously, adults relaxing and connecting. This integration of work, education, and leisure is something modern life has completely lost. We separate everything. Work time, family time, personal time. They lived holistically. Everything flowed together naturally. As night falls, Grok sits by the fire working on a new spear point. Not because he needs it urgently, because he enjoys the craft, because he wants to perfect his technique. This is art and meditation combined with practical skill. Vera is working on a decorated bag, weaving plant fibers into complex patterns that are both functional and beautiful. Again, this is creative expression integrated with utility. The kids are playing tracking games that develop observation skills, throwing games that improve coordination, strategy games that enhance problem-solving. Play and education are indistinguishable. But the real magic happens when someone starts a story. Everyone gathers closer. The fire casts dancing shadows, and someone begins telling a story that might be hundreds or thousands of years old. These stories are their internet, their library, their entertainment system. Stories that preserve technical knowledge about tool-making and hunting techniques. Stories that maintain historical records of migrations and important events. Stories that teach moral lessons and social values. Stories that are just purely entertaining. This is how knowledge survives, how culture persists, how identity is maintained across generations. And the stories aren't just recited, they're performed. With voice changes, gestures, dramatic pauses, the storyteller is part actor, part historian, part teacher. Everyone listening is engaged, learning, remembering. Music often accompanies these gatherings, bone flutes creating melodies that echo through the night, drums providing rhythm, voices joining in songs that everyone knows. This isn't primitive noise. This is sophisticated musical performance that strengthens social bonds and provides emotional fulfillment. As the evening progresses, people gradually drift towards sleep, but even this is intentional. They're banking fires for overnight burning, positioning weapons for quick access, conducting final security checks, settling into sleeping positions optimized for warmth and safety. When sleep comes, it's deep and restorative. The kind of sleep that comes from physical activity, natural circadian rhythms, and secure social bonds. No insomnia, no sleep aids, no alarm anxiety, just natural, healthy rest. And tomorrow, the cycle begins again with variations based on weather, season, and circumstances. But here's what strikes me most about this daily life. It's not primitive struggle. It's sophisticated living that balances survival with quality of life in ways modern society has forgotten. These people worked hard, but only as much as necessary. They had strong family bonds and community connections. They lived in direct relationship with the natural world. They had clear purposes and meaningful roles. Most importantly, they had mastery. Real expertise in skills that directly contributed to their well-being. They weren't cogs in some machine. They were complete human beings living fully integrated lives. But let's address the elephant in the cave. Life wasn't all successful hunts and community gatherings. These people faced challenges that would absolutely destroy us. I'm not talking about inconveniences. I'm talking about existential threats that could wipe out entire groups overnight. The world they lived in was actively trying to kill them every single day. The landscape was filled with predators that make modern dangerous animals look like puppies. Cave bears weighing 1,700 pounds with jaws that could crush bones, saber-toothed cats with 7-inch fangs designed specifically for killing large prey, short-faced bears that could run 40 miles per hour and stood 12 feet tall, dire wolves hunting in packs of 30 or more, with bite forces stronger than modern wolves. And the apex predator of human hunters, cave lions. These weren't modern lions wandering into caves. These were a completely different species, bigger, stronger, and specifically adapted for hunting humans and other large prey. Archaeological evidence shows cave lions actively hunted early humans. They learned human behavior patterns, they followed human groups, they developed hunting strategies specifically designed to kill people. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing a 500-pound killing machine might be stalking your family right now, and that's just one threat category. The environment itself was constantly lethal. This was the Ice Age, the real version, not the cute movie. Temperatures that dropped to 60 below zero. Blizzards that lasted for weeks. ice sheets that could advance miles in a single season, destroying everything. During the worst periods, most of Europe was uninhabitable. The landscape looked like Antarctica. No plants, no animals, nothing but ice and death. Humans survived anyway. Not just barely, they thrived. How? Through survival strategies so effective they kept our species alive through multiple near-extinction events. Take the Toba catastrophe. About 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano erupted in Indonesia with the force of multiple nuclear weapons. Ash clouds circled the planet. Temperatures dropped worldwide. Plant life died. Animals went extinct by the thousands. This was an actual apocalypse, the kind of event that would end modern civilization in months. Human population dropped to maybe 10,000 individuals worldwide. We came closer to extinction than any other point in our history, but we made it through. And scientists think they know how. They went underground, not just hiding in caves. They created elaborate underground survival systems, multi-chamber complexes with ventilation systems, water collection points, food storage areas, waste management systems. These were engineered survival bunkers that could sustain groups for months or years. The Brunicle Cave in France contains evidence of one of these systems. 176,000 years ago, Neanderthals built elaborate structures deep underground using carefully arranged stalagmites. We're talking about architecture 140,000 years before the earliest known surface buildings. But surviving environmental disasters was just one challenge. They also had to deal with other humans. When resources were scarce, different groups would compete, sometimes violently. Archaeological evidence shows clear signs of prehistoric warfare mass graves containing victims of coordinated attacks, defensive fortifications around settlements, weapons designed for fighting humans rather than animals, healed skull fractures from club impacts. But here's what's interesting. Most of the time they avoided conflict through sophisticated diplomacy. Trade networks served as peace treaties. Groups that traded together rarely fought. Marriage exchanges created family connections between groups. Shared cultural practices built alliances. They developed conflict resolution systems more effective than many modern diplomatic efforts. But when diplomacy failed, they were absolutely brutal. The Ovnet Cave in Germany contains evidence of what appears to be a massacre from about 8,000 years ago. Multiple skulls, mostly women and children, carefully arranged in what seems to be a ritual execution. Someone sent a very clear message about what happened to groups that crossed certain lines. These people understood that sometimes violence was necessary for survival, and when they fought with the same intelligence and planning they applied to everything else. Yet warfare wasn't their biggest killer, disease was. Without modern medicine, a simple infection could kill. A broken bone that healed wrong could mean death. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Parasites, bacteria, viruses, all constantly attacking. Yet somehow they developed medical knowledge that kept populations stable and growing. They discovered plant medicines we still use today. Willow bark for pain relief, the basis for aspirin. Echinacea for immune support. Feverfew for headaches, St. John's wort for mood. Hundreds of effective medicines derived from careful observation and experimentation. But their real medical breakthrough was surgery. Archaeologists have found skulls from 7,000 years ago showing successful brain surgery. Trepanation. Drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure or treat head injuries, and the bone shows healing. meaning patients survived. They were performing brain surgery with stone tools, and patients lived. They also developed sophisticated trauma treatment, setting broken bones with splints, suturing wounds with plant fiber or sinew, amputation when necessary to prevent infection spread. Skeletons show evidence of people surviving injuries that should have been fatal, compound fractures that healed, amputations that didn't get infected, head injuries that didn't cause death. Somehow, with no medical technology, they were saving lives that modern people would struggle to save without hospitals. But maybe their most impressive medical achievement was epidemic management. When plague or infectious disease hit a group, they had protocols: isolation of sick individuals, quarantine procedures, contact tracing to identify potential carriers, movement of healthy individuals away from contaminated areas. They understood disease transmission and developed containment strategies that worked. They recognized that certain illnesses spread through contact, that isolation could protect the healthy, that moving away from contaminated areas could save lives. Some archaeological sites show evidence of these practices, burial sites where infected individuals were interred away from main camps. Camps that were abandoned suddenly, suggesting rapid evacuation in response to disease outbreaks. Even remnants of what appear to be isolation shelters, smaller structures built at distances from main settlements. These people were practicing public health measures that wouldn't be formally codified until thousands of years later. But disease, warfare, and predators weren't even the biggest threat. The real killer was starvation. Despite their skills, food was often scarce. Droughts could eliminate plant foods for years. Climate changes could drive away animals. Natural disasters could destroy food stores. During the worst famines, groups faced impossible choices: stay and starve, or risk everything on migrations to unknown territories. Most chose migration, even though it meant crossing territory controlled by hostile groups, even though it meant traveling through landscapes filled with predators. These migrations required incredible courage. Planning routes through dangerous territory, coordinating movement of large groups including children and elderly, carrying supplies for journeys that might take months, navigating using only stars and landmarks. Some migrations covered thousands of miles. Imagine walking from Canada to Mexico with your entire family, carrying everything you own. No maps, no supply lines, no GPS, hostile groups trying to stop you at every river crossing. That's the kind of journey early humans routinely undertook when survival demanded it. The planning for these migrations was extraordinarily complex. They had to time departures to coincide with weather windows. They needed to know where water sources existed along the route. They had to predict where they might find food during the journey. They needed strategies for dealing with territorial groups whose lands they'd be crossing. They had to prepare psychologically for the hardships ahead, and they had to maintain group cohesion through what might be months of difficulty and danger. Archaeological evidence shows these migrations were remarkably successful. Human remains and artifacts trace clear migration paths across entire continents. The speed of human expansion during certain periods suggests these weren't random wanderings, but organized movements with clear objectives. Within just a few thousand years, humans spread from Africa to Australia, Europe to the Arctic, and eventually across the Americas. These weren't accidental dispersals. These were intentional colonizations by people with plans. But the most terrifying challenge was volcanic winter. When Toba erupted, temperatures dropped globally for years, maybe decades. Plant life died across entire continents. Animal populations crashed. This event nearly ended humanity, but some groups survived by developing extreme strategies, following retreating ice sheets and hunting Arctic animals, migrating to coasts and surviving on shellfish, moving underground and living in cave systems for generations. They ate things we wouldn't consider food: tree bark, stripped and processed to extract whatever nutrients it contained. Insect larvae dug from rotting logs and consumed raw or cooked grass seeds, laboriously gathered and ground into primitive flour. Lichen scraped from rocks and boiled into barely edible paste. Anything with calories, anything that wouldn't kill them. They developed preservation techniques that could keep food edible for years, smoking meat until it was nearly petrified, drying fish and game into jerky that could last months. Fermentation processes that created preserved foods with extended shelf lives, underground ice storage that functioned like natural freezers. They turned marginal environments into survival resources through pure intelligence and determination. Coastlines became sources of shellfish and seaweed. Rivers provided fish even when land animals were scarce. Caves offered shelter and sometimes unique food sources like bat guano that supported insect populations. They learned to exploit every ecological niche, every food source, every survival opportunity. Nothing was beneath them when survival was at stake. But here's the most impressive part. Even during these survival crises, they maintained cultural traditions. Archaeological evidence shows that even during the worst famines and disasters, they continued making art cave paintings dated to periods of extreme environmental stress. Carved figurines found in contexts suggesting they were created during times of hardship, jewelry and decorative objects that served no survival purpose but were crafted anyway. They continued conducting burial ceremonies. Even when food was scarce and every day was a struggle, they took time to properly bury their dead with grave goods, with care, with ritual. They continued teaching children not just survival skills, but cultural knowledge, stories, songs, traditions. They understood that losing their culture was another form of death, so they protected their traditions as fiercely as they protected their lives. This separates humans from every other species. When other animals face existential threats, they focus only on biological survival. When humans face existential threats, they fight to preserve not just their lives, but their way of life. Even when reduced to eating tree bark and hiding underground, they were still creating, still teaching, still maintaining the cultural practices that defined who they were. They were still human in the fullest sense, but survival came at a cost. Skeletons reveal the physical price. Injuries that never fully healed, arthritis from constant physical stress, dental wear from rough foods, signs of malnutrition during lean periods, growth interruptions in bones indicating childhood starvation, healed fractures that left permanent disabilities, evidence of chronic pain that individuals lived with for decades. The physical toll of Ice Age survival was brutal. The psychological stress must have been crushing. Constant vigilance against predators. Regular loss of family members to disease, accidents, violence, and starvation. The pressure of making decisions that affected entire groups. The trauma of warfare and conflict. The grief of watching children die. The fear of facing another winter with inadequate food stores. Modern people develop PTSD from far less. These people lived with trauma as daily reality, yet they maintained stable societies. They raised children who became successful adults. They created communities that lasted thousands of years. How? Through support systems that modern psychology is only beginning to understand, shared storytelling that processed traumatic experiences. When someone experienced something terrible, they could tell that story. The community would hear it, acknowledge it, and incorporate it into collective memory. This provided validation and helped process trauma in ways that isolation never could. Ritual activities provided meaning during difficult times. When someone died, there were rituals. When seasons changed, there were ceremonies. When important life transitions occurred, there were celebrations. These rituals created structure and meaning in a chaotic world. They reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their struggles had purpose, that their lives mattered. Close family bonds provided emotional security. In a world full of threats, family was the ultimate safety net. You could trust family to protect you, support you, and stand by you when everything else fell apart. These bonds were reinforced constantly through shared work, shared meals, shared sleeping spaces, and shared experiences. Family wasn't just people you were related to. Family was your survival unit. Regular celebrations reinforced group identity. Even during hard times, they found reasons to celebrate a successful hunt, a child's coming of age, the return of spring. These celebrations brought everyone together, reminded them of shared identity, and provided emotional respite from constant struggle. They understood that morale was as important as food stores for long-term survival. They also had spiritual practices that helped cope with uncertainty, not organized religion as we know it, but belief systems that provided comfort. Archaeological evidence suggests they believed in an afterlife. Burial practices indicate they thought death wasn't the end. In spiritual protection from ancestors, cave art and figurines suggest they believed deceased ancestors could provide guidance and protection. In meaningful connections between humans and nature, evidence of animal worship and nature-based spiritual practices indicates they saw themselves as part of a larger natural order. These beliefs provided psychological resources that helped them endure when facing starvation. Believing that ancestors were watching over them provided comfort. When dealing with death, believing in an afterlife made loss more bearable. When struggling against nature, believing in meaningful connections to the natural world gave purpose to their struggles. These weren't superstitions. These were sophisticated psychological tools that enhanced survival. But perhaps most importantly, they had purpose. Every individual had a clear, important role in group survival. Children knew they were learning skills they'd need. Adults knew their work directly contributed to their family's well-being. Elders knew their wisdom and experience were valued. No one was useless. No one was unnecessary. Everyone mattered. Every skill developed had direct relevance to well-being. You learned to track animals because your family needed meat. You learned to identify plants because your family needed food and medicine. You learned to make tools because your family needed weapons and implements. Learning wasn't abstract. It was immediately applicable. Every day presented challenges that required full intelligence and creativity. You weren't doing repetitive tasks that dulled the mind. You were solving novel problems, adapting to changing conditions, making decisions with real consequences. Your brain was fully engaged every day. They weren't struggling with meaninglessness. They were struggling with real challenges that demanded real solutions, and they were succeeding, not just surviving, growing stronger, smarter, more sophisticated with each generation. But their greatest test was coming. Around 40,000 years ago, the climate became even more unstable. Ice sheets advanced and retreated rapidly. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically. Entire ecosystems appeared and disappeared within single generations. This period of extreme chaos would determine whether humans were just another lucky species or something fundamentally new. The next several thousand years would test every survival strategy, every innovation, every social bond they had built. Some groups wouldn't make it. Entire populations disappeared during this period, leaving only archaeological traces, campsites that were never reoccupied, tool traditions that suddenly ended, genetic lineages that went extinct. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of population crashes in multiple regions. Some groups were wiped out by environmental changes they couldn't adapt to fast enough. Others were eliminated by warfare with more successful neighbors. Still others simply faded away, their numbers dwindling until they could no longer sustain viable populations. But others would not just survive. They would use this crisis to develop the most sophisticated technologies, art, and social systems in prehistoric history. They would emerge as fully modern humans ready to colonize the entire planet and eventually build civilizations that would reshape Earth itself. But first, they had to pass the ultimate test. And how they did it reveals just how extraordinary these people really were. They crushed it, absolutely dominated. The period from 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic, was when humans went from survivors to conquerors, when they transformed from just another species competing for resources into the most successful life form in planetary history. And they did it during the worst environmental conditions Earth had seen in millions of years, while ice sheets were chaotically advancing and retreating, while sea levels were swinging by hundreds of feet, while entire continents were becoming uninhabitable. Humans were having their greatest period of innovation and expansion. It's like they used the crisis as fuel. During this period, they invented art as we know it, not just cave paintings, sculpture, jewelry, decorative objects, portable art that traveled with nomadic groups, the Chauvet caves in France, with paintings so sophisticated that early archaeologists thought they must be recent forgeries. The Venus of Willendorf, a female figurine carved with incredible attention to anatomical detail, intricate ivory carvings that required hundreds of hours of detailed work with primitive tools. Abstract designs that suggest symbolic thinking and possibly early writing systems. But this wasn't just decoration, it was a communication revolution. These artistic traditions created shared cultural languages that united groups across vast distances. A person from what's now Germany could travel to Spain and immediately recognize familiar symbols and cultural practices. They'd see the same artistic motifs, the same symbolic representations, the same stylistic choices. This created instant recognition and trust between groups that had never met. Art became the first global communication system. It allowed humans to identify cultural allies across enormous distances. It created networks of mutual understanding that transcended language barriers. It established shared identity markers that facilitated trade, alliance formation, and information sharing. This was social technology as sophisticated as anything we have today. Maybe more so, because it worked without any centralized authority or formal organization. They also perfected musical traditions during this period, not just bone flutes. Entire ensembles of prehistoric instruments, drums made from hollow logs and animal hides stretched tight, whistles carved from bird bones with precise finger holes for different notes, rattles filled with seeds or pebbles that provided percussion, bull roarers that created haunting sounds that could carry for miles across open landscapes. Recent analysis of cave acoustics suggests they chose specific locations for performances based on sound properties. Some caves have natural acoustics that enhance certain frequencies. Some have echo effects that create layered sound. Some have resonance chambers that amplify volume. Prehistoric humans identified these acoustic properties and used them deliberately. They were creating concert halls 30,000 years before anyone built an actual concert hall. They were acoustic engineers before acoustics was a science. Musical performances weren't just entertainment. They served multiple social functions. Music synchronized group activities. When everyone moved to the same rhythm, coordinated work became easier. Music strengthened social bonds. Shared musical experiences created emotional connections between group members. Music transmitted cultural information. Songs carried stories, preserved history, and taught important lessons. Music provided spiritual experiences. Certain sounds and rhythms induced altered states of consciousness that were interpreted as spiritual communion. But the most incredible innovation was social technology. Faced with unprecedented environmental challenges, they developed cooperation systems that allowed hundreds or even thousands of people to work together toward common goals, trade networks that spanned continents. Archaeological evidence shows materials being traded across distances exceeding 1,000 miles. Obsidian from Central Europe found in Spain, seashells from Mediterranean coasts found in central France, amber from Baltic regions found in Italy. These weren't isolated incidents. They represent systematic trade networks that operated for thousands of years. Networks that required trust, communication, and mutual benefit. Networks that survived political changes, environmental crises, and population movements. Information sharing systems spread innovations across thousands of miles within decades. A new spear point design developed in France would appear in Germany within a generation. An improved tool-making technique discovered in Spain would show up in Italy shortly after. Artistic motifs created in one region would inspire variations hundreds of miles away. This information sharing happened without writing, without formal communication systems, without any organized method of transmission. It happened through human networks, through travelers who carried knowledge between groups, through traders who shared information along with goods, through migrants who brought innovations to new regions, through marriages that connected different communities. The speed of innovation diffusion during this period suggests humans had created remarkably efficient information networks. They created the first global civilization. Without writing, without formal governments, without any of the organizational tools we think are necessary for large-scale cooperation. How? Through shared cultural practices that created trust between groups that had never met. If you could make the same spear points, create the same artistic symbols, perform the same rituals, you were probably safe to trade with, maybe even ally with, maybe even intermarry with. Culture became technology for scaling cooperation beyond personal relationships. Instead of only trusting people you knew personally, you could trust people who shared your cultural markers. This allowed cooperation on scales that would have been impossible otherwise. Hunting parties composed of members from multiple groups. Trading expeditions that crossed territories controlled by different communities, alliance formations that united dozens of separate bands against common threats. This is when humans developed cumulative culture, the ability to build on previous innovations rather than starting over. Each generation improved on what came before, leading to exponential advancement in tools, techniques, and knowledge. A spear point design would be incrementally improved over generations. A hunting technique would be refined through countless applications. A tool-making method would be optimized through thousands of repetitions. This cumulative improvement created technological advancement that accelerated over time, and it worked so well that humans colonized the entire planet. During the Upper Paleolithic, humans reached Australia by building boats and navigating across 60 miles of open ocean. This required sophisticated boat-building technology, knowledge of ocean currents and weather patterns, navigation skills using stars and natural markers. The courage to sail into unknown waters with entire families. Archaeological evidence suggests this happened around 65,000 years ago, making it one of the earliest known ocean crossings in human history. They colonized the Arctic, developing cold weather technologies that allowed survival in temperatures that kill most mammals. Tailored clothing made from multiple layers of treated hides. Ice fishing techniques using specialized tools. Snow shelter construction that provided insulation in extreme cold. Hunting methods adapted for Arctic animals like seals and caribou. They learned to read ice conditions, predict weather in polar environments, and navigate during months of darkness. These adaptations allowed humans to survive in environments where no primate species had ever lived. They crossed the Bering Land Bridge and spread throughout the Americas in less than 2,000 years. From Alaska to the southern tip of South America, adapting to every environment encountered. The speed of this colonization is remarkable. It suggests organized migration with clear objectives rather than random wandering. Within just 2,000 years, humans had adapted to rainforests, deserts, mountains, coasts, grasslands, and tundra across 2 entire continents. Rainforests presented unique challenges: dense vegetation that limited visibility, high humidity that rotted materials, dangerous animals and poisonous plants, disease-carrying insects. But humans developed specialized adaptations. They learned which plants were edible and which were deadly. They developed hunting techniques for canopy animals. They created tools and weapons suited for jungle environments. They built elevated shelters that stayed dry during heavy rains. They discovered medicinal plants that treated tropical diseases. Desert peoples developed water conservation that allowed thriving in environments where most animals couldn't survive. They learned to read landscapes for hidden water sources. They developed storage methods that minimized evaporation. They created clothing that protected from sun while allowing cooling. They identified desert plants that stored water. They learned to travel during cooler parts of the day and shelter during extreme heat. They developed navigation techniques for featureless landscapes where getting lost meant death. Coastal peoples developed advanced boat building that went far beyond simple rafts. They created seaworthy vessels using available materials. Wood, hides, and plant fibers lashed together with cordage. Some designs used hollowed logs. Others used frames covered with waterproof skins. Some were small one-person craft for fishing. Others were large enough to carry entire families and their possessions. Deep-sea fishing techniques allowed accessing fish populations far from shore. They developed specialized hooks, lines, and nets. They learned to read ocean conditions and predict fish movements. They discovered preservation methods for seafood. Marine resource management sustained large populations for millennia. They understood sustainable harvesting. They didn't overexploit shellfish beds or fishing grounds. They knew which seasons were best for different species. They recognized the importance of leaving breeding populations intact. Some coastal groups managed marine resources so successfully that they supported population densities comparable to agricultural societies, all while remaining hunter-gatherers. Mountain peoples developed high-altitude survival techniques that dealt with thin air, extreme cold, and treacherous terrain. Specialized hunting equipment adapted for mountain animals like ibex and mountain goats. Techniques for climbing and traversing steep slopes safely. Methods for predicting avalanches and other mountain hazards. Vertical ecosystem management that exploited resources at different elevations seasonally. They'd follow animal migrations up mountains in summer and down in winter, maximizing access to food year-round. Each environment produced unique innovations that eventually spread through trade networks to benefit humans. Worldwide Arctic clothing designs influenced cold weather gear in other regions. Desert water conservation techniques were adapted for dry season survival elsewhere. Coastal boat building knowledge spread to lake and river communities. Mountain hunting techniques were modified for use in hill country. Human knowledge was growing exponentially, with innovations from one region improving life in completely different environments. And through all this expansion and innovation, they maintained core human qualities: art, music, storytelling, spiritual practices, family bonds, community cooperation. They didn't lose their humanity in pursuit of survival. They preserved and enhanced it. Every new region they colonized saw the emergence of unique artistic traditions, local styles of cave painting, regional variations in figurine design, distinctive musical instruments made from local materials. Each culture developed its own stories, its own songs, its own ways of expressing the human experience, but these weren't isolated developments. Cultural exchange ensured that innovations and artistic ideas spread between regions. A painting style developed in one area would influence artists hundreds of miles away. A musical tradition from one region would be adapted and modified by another. A storytelling technique perfected by one group would be adopted by their neighbors. Humanity was creating not just many separate cultures, but a global cultural network where ideas flowed freely. By 10,000 years ago, when the Ice Age ended and agriculture began, humans had become something unprecedented, a species that could survive anywhere, adapt to anything, improve conditions through intelligence and cooperation rather than genetic evolution. They had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had adapted to every climate zone on Earth. They had developed technologies for every aspect of life, tools for every conceivable task, social systems for every type of challenge, cultural practices that provided meaning, purpose, and psychological resilience. They had become master survivors. But here's what really gets me. When the Ice Age ended and conditions improved, they didn't relax. They didn't settle into comfortable routines and stop innovating. They used accumulated knowledge and skills to create something entirely new. Agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of plants and domestication of animals. This required observing plant growth cycles over many years, experimenting with different planting techniques, selecting seeds from the most productive plants, understanding soil conditions and water requirements. This was sophisticated botany before botany existed as a science. Permanent settlements followed agriculture. Once you're growing food in specific locations, mobility becomes less practical. So humans started building permanent structures, not temporary shelters that could be dismantled and moved, but substantial buildings designed to last for years or decades. This required new construction techniques, new materials, new engineering knowledge. They figured it all out. Specialized crafts emerged from permanent settlement. When you're not carrying everything you own, you can have more possessions, more tools, more equipment. Specialization becomes possible. Some people can focus entirely on pottery, others on tool making, others on textile production. This specialization led to higher quality goods and faster innovation in each craft. Complex societies developed from specialization. When not everyone is producing food, you can have other roles: leaders, organizers, traders, artists, spiritual leaders. This social complexity eventually led to cities, formal governments, writing systems, everything we associate with civilization. But none of this would have been possible without the foundations laid during the Paleolithic. Every innovation that followed, from agriculture to the internet, was built on knowledge and skills developed by Paleolithic ancestors. The ability to plan long-term projects came from Paleolithic humans planning seasonal migrations and multi-year tool production. The capacity for complex cooperation came from Paleolithic social networks that united dozens of separate groups. The skills for tool-making and problem-solving were refined over hundreds of thousands of years of Paleolithic innovation. The social bonds that make large-scale societies possible were forged in small Paleolithic communities where trust and cooperation meant survival. The creative impulses that drive art, music, and scientific discovery emerged during the Paleolithic explosion of symbolic thought. The curiosity that drives exploration and innovation was honed by Paleolithic humans constantly adapting to new environments. The resilience that allows humans to overcome setbacks and disasters was developed by Paleolithic survivors who endured repeated near-extinction events. All of this, everything that makes us human, came from those primitive cavemen. So what does this mean for us today? First, it means we're capable of way more than we think. The same brains that survived ice ages and volcanic winters are the brains we have today. Genetically, we're almost identical to Upper Paleolithic humans. The same cognitive capabilities, the same capacity for learning and innovation, the same potential for cooperation and resilience, the same capacity for innovation, cooperation and resilience that got our ancestors through impossible challenges is still available to us. It's not something we lost. It's not something that atrophied. It's there, waiting to be used. When we look at modern problems, climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts, political instability, economic challenges, we're not facing anything more difficult than what our ancestors routinely overcame. They survived global environmental disasters with stone tools and animal skin clothing. They survived population crashes that reduced humanity to a few thousand individuals. They survived ice ages, volcanic winters, megafauna predators, and constant warfare with other groups. We have technology they couldn't imagine. Computers, medicine, global communication, advanced materials, abundant energy. If they could figure out solutions to existential threats with nothing but their intelligence and determination, we can definitely handle whatever we're facing now. Second, it means we've lost touch with fundamental human capabilities worth recovering. The ability to read natural environments is almost gone. Most modern people can't predict weather by observing clouds, can't identify edible plants growing around them, can't navigate without GPS, can't start a fire without matches. These aren't trivial skills. These are fundamental human capabilities that our ancestors considered basic competence. The skills for making things with our hands have atrophied. Most people can't make their own tools, can't repair their own equipment, can't create useful objects from raw materials. We've become completely dependent on industrial production for everything. The capacity for deep cooperation has been replaced by shallow, transactional relationships. Paleolithic humans had community bonds that meant something. People who would risk their lives for each other, share resources during scarcity, support each other through hardship. Modern people often don't even know their neighbors. The practice of integrating work, family, art, and community into cohesive lifestyles has been replaced by rigid separation. We have work time, family time, personal time, all carefully segregated. Paleolithic humans lived holistically. Everything flowed together naturally. Work included family, leisure included education, art included utility. These aren't primitive throwbacks. These are advanced human capabilities that contributed to 300,000 years of successful survival and development. Modern life has given us incredible advantages, longer lifespans, greater comfort, more knowledge, wider opportunities, but it's also disconnected us from core human strengths that might be worth rediscovering. Not abandoning modern life, but reclaiming some of what we've lost, learning to read environments, developing manual skills, building real community, integrating different aspects of life. Third, it means we come from an incredible lineage. Your ancestors weren't just lucky survivors who happened to be in the right place at the right time. They were innovative geniuses who repeatedly overcame impossible challenges through intelligence, creativity, and cooperation. They survived when other human species went extinct. They thrived when other animals died out by the thousands. They expanded when other species contracted. They innovated when others stagnated. You carry genes that survived ice ages that killed most other species, volcanic winters that nearly ended all life, predator attacks from animals that specialized in hunting humans, near extinction events that reduced humanity to a few thousand 100,000 individuals scattered across the globe. Your genetic line goes back unbroken for hundreds of thousands of years. Every single one of your ancestors survived to reproductive age. Every single one successfully raised offspring. Every single one passed down their knowledge and capabilities. That's an unbroken chain of success stretching back to the origin of our species. You inherit cognitive capabilities tested and refined by hundreds of thousands of years of problem solving. Your brain is the product of relentless evolutionary pressure. Only the smartest, most adaptable, most resilient humans survived to reproduce. The accumulation of generations of selection means you have inherited incredible potential. The same pattern recognition abilities that allowed your ancestors to track animals, the same spatial reasoning that allowed them to navigate vast territories, the same social intelligence that allowed them to cooperate in large groups, the same creative thinking that allowed them to innovate constantly. You're not just descended from survivors, you're descended from champions. From people who were the absolute best at what they did. Your hunting ancestors were the ones who brought down the most game. Your gathering ancestors were the ones who identified the best food sources. Your warrior ancestors were the ones who won their battles. Your shaman ancestors were the ones who healed the sick and guided the community. You come from the best of the best, repeated across thousands of generations. But maybe most importantly, the story of Paleolithic ancestors reminds us what humans can do when we step up. When facing existential threats, they didn't panic or give up. They didn't despair or resign themselves to fate. They got creative. They thought of new solutions. They tried different approaches. They learned from failures and built on successes. They cooperated. They set aside individual interests for group survival. They shared resources, knowledge, and effort. They worked together toward common goals even when cooperation was difficult. They innovated. They constantly improved their tools, techniques, and strategies. They never settled for good enough when better was possible. They experimented, tested, and refined endlessly. They adapted. When environments changed, they changed with them. When old strategies stopped working, they developed new ones. When familiar resources disappeared, they found alternatives. They were endlessly flexible and resilient. When resources were scarce, they found new sources or used resources more efficiently. When game animals declined, they shifted to fish or plants. When plants died off, they focused on animals. When both were scarce, they found marginal foods that most animals ignored. They extracted maximum value from minimum resources through intelligence and creativity. When environments became hostile, they developed technologies to survive or migrated to better conditions. When ice sheets advanced, they developed cold weather survival technologies. When that wasn't enough, they migrated to warmer regions. When coasts flooded from rising seas, they moved inland. When inland resources declined, they moved back to coasts. They were constantly adapting their strategies to changing conditions. When conflicts arose, they created diplomatic solutions or defended themselves effectively. They preferred peace through trade and alliance. But when attacked, they fought skillfully and decisively. They understood that survival sometimes required violence, but violence was a last resort, not a first choice. They balanced cooperation with competition, peace with warfare, trust with vigilance. They met every challenge with intelligence, determination, and mutual support. No challenge was too great, no obstacle was insurmountable, no disaster was the end. They kept going, kept adapting, kept surviving no matter what the world threw at them, and they didn't just survive. They thrived. They created art, music, and cultural traditions that brought joy and meaning even during the most difficult periods. They understood that surviving wasn't enough. Life had to be worth living. Even during famines, they made art. Even during wars, they made music. Even during disasters, they told stories and celebrated what was good in life. They understood that preserving humanity was as important as preserving life. That what made them human, the culture, the connections, the creativity, was worth protecting even when survival was uncertain. They refused to become mere animals scratching for survival. They remained fully human even in the worst conditions. That's the real legacy, not primitive survival, but sophisticated human living under challenging conditions. They proved that humans can adapt to anything, survive everything, and maintain essential humanity through any crisis. They showed that the human spirit is unbreakable, that human intelligence is unlimited, that human cooperation can overcome any obstacle. They showed us what we're capable of when necessary, and that capability still exists. It's not something we lost. It's not something that disappeared with the Paleolithic. It's still there, dormant maybe, but ready to emerge when needed. So next time you're facing a challenge that seems impossible, remember where you came from. Remember your ancestors survived things that would end modern civilization in weeks. Remember that every person alive today is descended from an unbroken line of survivors who overcame everything the world could throw at them. Remember, you carry in your genes and brain the accumulated wisdom of 300,000 years of human problem solving, the solutions your ancestors developed, the techniques they perfected, the resilience they demonstrated. All of that is part of your inheritance. Remember, every challenge you face has been faced before by people with far fewer resources who not only survived, but thrived. Your work deadline, your ancestors faced starvation, your relationship problems, your ancestors faced community conflicts that could turn violent, your financial stress, your ancestors faced resource scarcity that meant life or death. Your health issues, your ancestors faced diseases and injuries without any medical care, and they handled it. They found solutions. They kept going. They made it work. And remember that being human isn't about having easy lives. It's never been about comfort or convenience. Being human is about rising to meet whatever challenges life presents with intelligence, creativity, cooperation, and determination. It's about adapting when conditions change, innovating when old solutions stop working, cooperating when challenges are too big for individuals, persevering when success seems impossible. That's what it meant to be a caveman. That's what it means to be human today. The only difference is now we know our history. We know what we're capable of. We know we come from the greatest survivors in the history of life on Earth. And we know that whatever challenges we face in the future, we have everything we need to overcome them. The intelligence to solve any problem, the creativity to innovate solutions, the social capacity to cooperate at massive scales, the resilience to endure any hardship, the adaptability to thrive in any environment. Because we're not just modern humans trying to figure things out from scratch. We're the descendants of cavemen. We're the inheritors of 300,000 years of survival expertise. We're the latest generation in an unbroken line of champions who never gave up, never stopped adapting, never lost their humanity even in the worst conditions. That's not just our history, that's who we are, that's what we're capable of, that's our legacy and our potential. And when you really understand that, when you really internalize what your ancestors accomplished and what that means about you, it changes everything. The challenges you face don't seem quite so impossible. The obstacles in your path don't seem quite so insurmountable because you know that people with far less overcame far more. And if they could do it, so can you, not despite your humanity, but because of it, because being human means being capable of extraordinary things when necessity demands it. But let's get even more specific about what daily life really looked like, because there are so many details that completely change how we understand these people. Let's go back to Grok and his family and really dive into the minutiae of their existence, because it's in these details that you really see how sophisticated they were. Take tool making, for instance. We talked about hunting and we mentioned tools, but we didn't really get into what tool making actually involved. This wasn't just picking up a rock and hitting another rock. This was a complex manufacturing process that required years of training and incredible skill. When Grok sits down to make a new spear point, he's engaging in a process that modern researchers struggle to replicate even with instruction. First, he needs the right raw material. Not just any rock will work. He needs fine-grained stone that fractures predictably, flint, obsidian, chert, or similar materials, and he needs to know where to find it. Some of the best tool-making stone comes from specific geological formations. Grok knows locations dozens of miles away where superior stone can be quarried. He's made journeys specifically to collect high-quality materials. Some groups traded for exotic stones from hundreds of miles away because local materials weren't good enough. Once he has the right stone, he needs to prepare it. This often involves heating, which changes the fracture properties of the stone and makes it easier to work, but too much heat and the stone becomes brittle and useless. Too little and it doesn't improve. He needs to heat it to exactly the right temperature, which he judges by experience, not with thermometers. Then he needs to let it cool at the right rate. This preparation process alone can take hours or days. Now comes the actual knapping, the process of shaping the stone. Grok holds the stone core in one hand, a hammerstone in the other. He needs to strike at precisely the right angle, with exactly the right force, at exactly the right location. Too hard and the stone shatters. Too soft and nothing happens. Wrong angle and the flake goes in the wrong direction. He's calculating vectors, forces, and material properties in his head instantaneously without any formal understanding of physics. Each strike removes a flake. The shape of that flake depends on dozens of variables: the angle of the striking platform, the force of the blow, the type of hammerstone used, the inherent properties of the stone being worked. Grok is controlling all these variables simultaneously, adjusting constantly based on how the stone responds. Modern knappers describe it as a conversation with the stone. You strike, the stone responds. You adjust your next strike based on that response. To create a finished spear point, Grok might make hundreds of individual strikes, each one building on the previous ones. Each one requiring concentration and skill. One mistake and he might have to start over. The waste flakes scattered around him represent hours of work, countless decisions, constant adjustments. When researchers analyze these waste flakes, they can reconstruct the entire manufacturing process. They can see the napper's skill level, their technique, even their individual style, but Grok isn't making a generic spear point. He's making a specific type of point for a specific purpose. Points for hunting large animals need to be robust and able to penetrate thick hides. Points for smaller game can be lighter and more delicate. Points designed for throwing need different aerodynamics than points for thrusting spears. He's engineering his tools for specific applications, like a modern manufacturer designing specialized products. And he's doing all this while also thinking about aesthetics. Archaeological evidence shows that Paleolithic toolmakers often created points that were more refined than functionally necessary. They cared about symmetry, about elegant lines, about beautiful workmanship. Tools weren't just utilitarian objects. They were expressions of the maker's skill and artistry. A well-made tool was a source of pride. Poor workmanship was shameful. This attention to quality served social functions too. When Grok makes an exceptionally beautiful spear point, others notice. It demonstrates his skill and knowledge. It increases his status in the community. It makes him a more attractive trade partner, an ally. In some cases, finely made tools were traded as prestige items. Valued more for their workmanship than their utility, tool-making wasn't just survival skill. It was art, science, and social currency combined. Now let's talk about their clothing, because this is another area where the sophistication is mind-blowing. You might think cavemen wore crude animal skins wrapped around themselves. The reality is far more complex. Vera isn't just throwing hides over her family. She's creating tailored garments using advanced textile techniques. First comes hide processing, which is an art in itself. A fresh animal hide is stiff, perishable, and not particularly useful. To turn it into usable leather requires extensive processing. The hide must be cleaned of all flesh and fat. This is done using specialized scrapers that Vera has made for this specific purpose. Different scrapers for different stages of the process. The scraping must be thorough, but not so aggressive that it damages the hide. Next comes tanning, the process that preserves the hide and makes it supple. There are multiple tanning methods, and Vera knows several. Brain tanning uses the animal's own brain, which contains oils and compounds that preserve and soften the hide. Every animal has enough brain matter to tan its own hide, a fact that Paleolithic people discovered through experimentation. The brain is mashed into a paste, worked into the hide, and then the hide is stretched and worked for hours as it dries. Smoke tanning uses smoke from specific woods to preserve the hide and make it water resistant. The hide is suspended over a smoldering fire for hours or days. The smoke penetrates the fibers and creates a chemical change that preserves the leather. Different woods produce different results. Some create darker colors, some provide better water resistance, some are better for certain types of hides. Vera knows which wood to use for which purpose. Vegetable tanning uses tannins from plant materials. Oak bark, willow bark, or other tannin-rich plants are boiled to extract the tannins, and hides are soaked in this solution for weeks. This creates very durable leather suitable for heavy-duty applications. Once the hides are tanned, they must be softened. This is done by working the hide, stretching it, rubbing it, pulling it repeatedly until the fibers separate and the hide becomes supple. All of this processing takes days or weeks per hide. It's labor-intensive, requiring strength, patience, and skill, but the result is high-quality leather that can be sewn into clothing, and yes, they sewed. Vera has needles made from bone or ivory carefully carved with eyes for thread. The thread is sinew, the tough connective tissue from animals or plant fibers twisted into cord. She's sewing with materials she made herself, using tools she made herself, creating clothing she designed herself. And the clothing isn't simple. Archaeological evidence from preserved garments shows sophisticated tailoring, fitted sleeves, hoods, closures using bone buttons or leather ties, multiple layers for insulation. Some garments show decorative stitching that serves no functional purpose. They were making clothes that were both effective and beautiful. Clothing that fit well, moved well, and looked good. Different climates required different clothing strategies. In cold regions, they created layered systems, an inner layer of soft hide against the skin, middle layers for insulation, an outer layer that was wind and water resistant. Hoods and gloves and boots, all tailored and fitted. Some Arctic clothing from this period shows design features that weren't improved upon until modern synthetic materials became available. In hot climates, they created lightweight, breathable garments that provided sun protection without causing overheating. In wet climates, they created water-resistant outer layers using specific tanning methods and sometimes plant-based waterproofing. Every climate presented unique challenges, and they developed unique solutions. Clothing technology was as diverse and sophisticated as any other aspect of their material culture. They also created footwear, and this is another area of remarkable innovation. Going barefoot in Ice Age environments would quickly lead to frostbite and death. They needed effective boots. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic studies of traditional peoples show multiple boot designs. Simple moccasins, made from a single piece of hide, wrapped around the foot and tied at the ankle. More complex boot constructions with separate soles, uppers, and insulation layers. Some boots were stuffed with grass for additional insulation. Arctic boots sometimes featured double layers with an air gap between them for superior insulation. Waterproof boots for wet environments used special preparation techniques. Some cultures created crampons, traction devices attached to boots for walking on ice. They were solving problems that modern manufacturers solve with advanced materials and industrial processes, but doing it with Stone Age materials and hand tools. Let's talk about their food in more detail too, because their diet was far more diverse and sophisticated than you might think. We mentioned that they ate meat, plants, nuts, and berries, but that barely scratches the surface. These people were using hundreds of different food sources, and they were preparing them in complex ways. Their plant knowledge was encyclopedic. Vera can identify hundreds of plant species by sight. She knows which parts are edible and when. Roots that are good in fall but toxic in spring, leaves that are edible when young but poisonous when mature, seeds that need processing to be safe, nuts that require leaching to remove toxins. This knowledge was accumulated over thousands of years and transmitted through careful teaching. Some plants required complex processing. Acorns, for example, are extremely nutritious but contain bitter tannins that make them inedible raw. The tannins must be leached out by repeated washing or boiling. This processing takes days, but renders acorns into a valuable food source that can be stored for months. Many groups relied heavily on processed acorns during winter when other foods were scarce. They also harvested aquatic plants, water lily roots, cattail shoots, various seaweeds, and algae. These plants often grow in abundance and provide reliable food sources. Some aquatic plants are available year-round, making them important survival foods during lean seasons. They also ate fungi, mushrooms that they could identify with certainty. Eating the wrong mushroom means death, so this required absolute precision in identification. Their meat sources were equally diverse. Large game like mammoth, bison, deer, elk, medium-sized game like pigs, goats, sheep. Small game like rabbits, birds, rodents, fish, shellfish, crustaceans, insects, particularly larvae, which are high in protein and fat, eggs from bird nests. They were opportunistic omnivores who could exploit any food source available. But they weren't just eating these foods raw. They had multiple cooking techniques that improved nutrition, safety, and flavor. Roasting over open fires was the simplest method, meat skewered on sticks and held over flames. But they also had more sophisticated techniques. Earth ovens involved digging pits, heating stones in fires, placing the stones in the pit with food, and covering everything to create an underground oven. This method allowed slow cooking that broke down tough plant fibers and rendered even marginal foods edible. Boiling was achieved before pottery by using waterproof containers made from bark or hide. Hot stones were dropped into water to bring it to a boil. This technique allowed creating soups and stews that combined multiple ingredients. Boiling also made some foods safer by killing parasites and bacteria. They also smoked foods for preservation. Fish, meat, and some plant foods could be preserved for months by smoking. The smoke created a bacterial barrier, and dehydration prevented spoilage. Drying was another preservation method. Thin strips of meat dried in the sun or wind would keep for months. Berries and other fruits could be dried and stored. Some plant roots could be dried and ground into flour for later use. Fermentation was probably used too, though evidence is limited. Fermented foods have improved nutritional value and storage life. Many traditional cultures have fermentation techniques that likely date to the Paleolithic. They also created food caches, storing supplies for later use. Underground pits in permafrost regions functioned as natural freezers. Elevated platforms kept food away from ground predators. Careful wrapping protected from insects and moisture. Food storage allowed surviving periods when fresh food wasn't available. It required planning ahead, controlling consumption, and defending stores from theft by animals or other humans. Their meal planning showed sophisticated nutritional understanding. They balanced different food types to create complete nutrition. Combining plant proteins with animal proteins provided all essential amino acids, including organ meats provided vitamins that muscle meat lacked. Eating bone marrow provided crucial fats. They didn't understand biochemistry, but they understood through experience what combinations kept people healthy. They also had food taboos and preferences that varied by culture. Some groups avoided certain animals for spiritual reasons. Others had preferences for specific preparations. Food wasn't just fuel. It was culture, identity, and social bonding. Shared meals reinforced community. Special foods marked important occasions. Recipes and preparation techniques were passed down through generations. Let's talk about their shelters in more depth too. We mentioned that Grok's group built sophisticated structures, but what did that actually mean? These weren't crude huts thrown together in an afternoon. They were engineered dwellings that required planning, materials gathering, and skilled construction. Shelter type varied by environment and season. In forested areas, they built substantial structures using wooden poles, branches, and bark. The frame was erected first, with strong poles forming the basic structure. Smaller branches were woven between the poles to create walls. Bark sheets or hide were layered over this framework to create weatherproof covering. The structures were surprisingly large, sometimes housing multiple families. In treeless areas, they used mammoth bones as structural elements, enormous bones, skulls, and tusks arranged to form a framework. Hides stretched over this framework and weighted down with more bones. These structures could be quite large and were remarkably sturdy. Archaeological evidence shows some were occupied for extended periods, suggesting they were comfortable and effective. In Arctic regions, they built substantial winter houses, sometimes partially underground for insulation. The excavated earth provided insulation on the walls. Roofs were constructed from whatever materials were available, supported by whalebone, driftwood, or carefully arranged stones. Entry tunnels dug below floor level prevented cold air from entering the living space. These structures could be quite warm inside, even when outside temperatures were deadly. They also built different structures for different purposes, larger communal structures for gatherings, ceremonies, and shared activities, smaller family dwellings for sleeping and privacy, storage structures for food and equipment, work areas where messy tasks like hide processing were performed. Some camps show evidence of careful spatial planning with different activity areas organized for efficiency and hygiene. Interior organization showed sophisticated thinking. Sleeping areas positioned away from entrances to avoid cold drafts. Work areas positioned near entrances for better light and ventilation. Fires positioned for optimal heat distribution. Storage areas organized for easy access. Some shelters even show evidence of furniture. Raised sleeping platforms, seating areas, storage compartments. They were creating homes, not just shelters. They also managed waste carefully. Refuse areas were established away from living spaces. Organic waste was buried or removed to avoid attracting predators. Tool-making debris was swept into designated areas. This wasn't just cleanliness. This was public health management that reduced disease and pest problems. They understood that living in their own filth created problems, so they developed sanitation practices. Water management was another crucial consideration. Camps were positioned near reliable water sources, but not so close that flooding was a risk. Some camps show evidence of water collection systems, carved channels that directed rainwater into collection containers, paths designed to minimize mud and erosion. During winter, they would melt snow and ice for water, requiring constant fire maintenance and planning. Their seasonal movements weren't random wandering. They followed planned circuits that took them to different resource zones at optimal times. Spring camps near rivers where fish were spawning, summer camps in highlands where game was abundant and insects less problematic. Fall camps near nut groves and fruit-bearing areas, winter camps in sheltered valleys with firewood supplies. These circuits were followed for generations, with knowledge of each location passed down through oral tradition. The timing of moves was carefully calculated too early, and resources weren't ready. Too late, and they'd already been exploited by others. Weather windows had to be considered. Can we make the journey before storms hit? Is the river crossing safe at this season? Will we arrive before snow blocks the passes? Modern project managers would recognize this as sophisticated logistics and resource planning. Let me tell you about their toolkits, because these weren't people carrying one or two items. Archaeological sites show they had extensive tool collections, dozens of different specialized implements. Cutting tools of various sizes for different tasks, scraping tools for hide processing, boring tools for making holes, grinding stones for processing plant materials, hammer stones for knapping, anvil stones for support while working. They also had organic tools that rarely survive in the archaeological record, but ethnographic studies show were crucial: wooden digging sticks for harvesting roots, fishing spears and hooks, snares and traps for capturing animals, baskets for gathering and transport cordage in various thicknesses for different purposes, water containers made from bladders, stomachs, or bark. All of these items required manufacturing skill and represented significant investments of time. The organization and maintenance of these tools was another ongoing task. Tools needed to be sharpened regularly, hafts needed repair when bindings loosened, broken tools needed replacement. This ongoing maintenance was as important as the original manufacturing. A dull scraper was useless. A broken spear at the wrong moment could mean death. Tool maintenance was constant background activity happening during downtime, while socializing, while supervising children. Let's also talk about their communication in more detail. We mentioned language, but how did they actually talk to each other? Obviously, we can't know exactly, but linguistic analysis and comparison with modern hunter-gatherer languages gives us clues. They almost certainly had fully modern language with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary, and ability to express abstract concepts. Their vocabulary would have been highly specialized in certain areas, dozens of words for different types of snow and ice in Arctic regions, numerous terms for plant growth stages, specific vocabulary for animal behaviors and conditions, detailed terminology for tool-making processes and materials, technical language as sophisticated as any modern specialty. Try explaining pressure flaking to someone without specialized vocabulary. It's nearly impossible. They must have had precise technical language for transmitting complex knowledge. But language wasn't just utilitarian, they also had artistic language, poetry, songs, elaborate storytelling with complex narratives, ritual language used in ceremonies, probably different speech registers for different social contexts, formal speech for addressing elders, casual speech among peers, special language for teaching children. Language is never just information transfer, it's social bonding, identity expression, artistic creation. Their songs and stories served multiple functions we've largely lost. They preserved history without writing. Important events were encoded in songs and stories that could be memorized and repeated accurately. They transmitted technical knowledge. A song about plant gathering might encode information about what to look for, when to harvest, how to prepare. Songs helped memorize complex information. Try remembering a list versus remembering a song. The song is easier. Stories taught moral lessons and social values. Tales of ancestors who made good or bad decisions and faced consequences. These stories shaped behavior and maintained social norms. They also provided entertainment and emotional connection. A well-told story was appreciated for its artistry, not just its information. Master storytellers had high status, and their performances were anticipated events. They probably also had humor, jokes, teasing, wordplay. Humans everywhere engage in verbal play. The content of their jokes is lost to history, but the presence of humor in their lives is almost certain. Laughter reduces stress, strengthens social bonds, diffuses tension. In a difficult life, humour was probably crucial for psychological health. Let's talk about their children in more detail too, because child rearing in Paleolithic communities was fundamentally different from modern parenting. Children weren't segregated into age groups in schools. They were integrated into all aspects of community life. From infancy, children were constantly with adults, observing, learning, gradually participating. Infant care was intensive and constant. Babies were carried constantly, usually in specially designed carriers that allowed hands-free transport. This constant contact provided security, regulated temperature, and allowed breastfeeding on demand. Babies slept with parents, providing warmth and security. Modern research shows this sleep-in arrangement reduces SIDS and improves infant development. Paleolithic people discovered this through experience. Breastfeeding often continued for several years, providing nutrition, immune support, and birth spacing. Extended breastfeeding helps prevent pregnancy, naturally spacing children to manageable intervals. This wasn't deliberate birth control in the modern sense, but it functioned that way. It also meant older children had years of intense parental bonding before siblings arrived. As children grew, they learned through participation. A 3-year-old might help gather easy-to-find plant foods. A 5-year-old might practice throwing small spears at targets. A 7-year-old might help with hide processing. A 10-year-old might participate in actual hunts in supporting roles. Learning was incremental, building skills through constant practice and gradually increasing responsibility. There was no formal curriculum. Children learned what they observed adults doing. They learned what interested them. They learned what they needed to survive. A child fascinated by tracking would spend time with skilled trackers, observing, asking questions, practicing. A child drawn to tool making would watch knappers at work, try making their own tools, receive feedback and guidance. Education was personalized and self-directed within the framework of necessary skills. Children also learned through play, but their play was practice for adult activities. Boys wrestled and played hunting games. Girls practiced childcare with younger siblings and dolls. Both sexes played tracking games, throwing games, building games. Play developed skills, strength, coordination, and strategic thinking. It was fun, but it was also education. Discipline was probably less harsh than in many agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherer groups studied by anthropologists typically don't use corporal punishment. Physical punishment of children is rare or absent. Instead, they use explanation, modeling, and natural consequences. A child who doesn't help gather food simply gets less to eat. A child who doesn't maintain their tools finds their tools don't work when needed. This approach develops intrinsic motivation and personal responsibility. Children also had more autonomy than modern children. They weren't constantly supervised and directed. They were allowed to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from consequences. This developed confidence, problem-solving ability, and independence. By adolescence, they were fully capable adults who contributed substantially to group survival. Adolescence wasn't a prolonged transitional period. By mid-teens, individuals were adults with full responsibilities and rights. Coming-of-age ceremonies marked this transition. Varying by culture but always significant, These ceremonies often involved tests of skill, endurance, or courage. Successfully completing the ceremony meant recognition as an adult member of the community. Let me tell you about their astronomical knowledge too, because this is another area where they were surprisingly sophisticated. They didn't just glance at the sky occasionally, they were careful observers who tracked celestial patterns over years and used this knowledge for practical purposes. They knew the stars intimately, constellations that helped with navigation, seasonal stars that indicated when to move camps or when certain foods would be available, the movement of planets across the sky, the cycles of the moon. All of this information was encoded in stories and songs that preserved astronomical knowledge across generations. Some archaeological sites show clear evidence of astronomical observation, stone arrangements that align with solstices or equinoxes, cave art that may represent star patterns or lunar cycles, bone artifacts with scratches that appear to be lunar calendars tracking moon phases across months. They were paying attention to the sky and using that information systematically. This knowledge had practical applications. Navigation, obviously. The stars provided reliable directional references at night. But also timing. Knowing that a particular star rising at sunset meant winter was 6 weeks away allowed planning. Knowing that the moon would be full in 5 days allowed planning hunts that required nighttime visibility. Understanding tides and their relationship to lunar cycles improved shellfish gathering. They also probably attached spiritual significance to celestial events, eclipses, comets, unusual astronomical phenomena. Without scientific explanations, these events were interpreted through spiritual frameworks, but spiritual interpretation didn't mean they weren't also carefully observed and recorded. Ancient people often combined practical observation with spiritual meaning. Their mathematical abilities were also more developed than you might expect. They had counting systems, obviously. You can't coordinate group activities without counting. They probably had number words well into the hundreds, if not higher. They understood basic geometry. Creating symmetrical tools requires understanding of symmetry and proportion. Building shelters requires spatial reasoning and measurement. Some artifacts suggest even more sophisticated mathematics, bone fragments with regularly spaced notches that might represent counting systems or calendars, tool production that suggests understanding of ratios and proportions, distribution of resources that suggests fair division algorithms. They were doing mathematics even if they didn't think of it that way. Let's talk about their medicine in even more detail, because this deserves deeper exploration. We mentioned plant medicines and surgery, but their medical knowledge was vast. They understood wound care, cleaning wounds to prevent infection, using plant poultices that actually had antibacterial properties, bandaging techniques that protected injuries while allowing healing. They understood bone setting. Archaeological evidence shows broken bones that were set properly and healed aligned. This requires understanding of anatomy and proper technique. Splinting materials had to immobilize the injury while allowing circulation. The patient had to be kept still during healing, requiring weeks or months of care. Successfully healed fractures show they understood all of this. They performed amputations. Some skeletons show clean amputations that healed successfully. This means they understood that a severely damaged limb sometimes needed removal to save the patient's life. They had techniques for controlling bleeding, methods for preventing infection. care protocols that supported healing, and patients survived and lived for years after these operations. They also had dental care. Some skulls show evidence of dental work, abscessed teeth that were drained, damaged teeth that were removed. They didn't have modern anesthesia, so these procedures were agonizing, but they were sometimes necessary and they were performed successfully. Pain management was crucial. They had analgesic plants. Willow bark, which contains salicin. The compound aspirin is derived from poppy plants, which contain opiates. Various other plants with pain-relieving properties. They knew which plants helped with which types of pain, how much to use, how to prepare them for maximum effectiveness. They also had antiseptics. Honey, which has natural antibacterial properties, certain tree resins with antimicrobial effects, specific plants whose extracts kill bacteria. Modern analysis of traditional medicines has confirmed many actually work. These weren't superstitions. These were effective treatments discovered through careful observation and experimentation. Mental health care was also part of their medical practice. Not in the modern psychiatric sense, but they recognized when someone was suffering psychologically and had intervention methods, spiritual healing ceremonies that provided psychological support, community support for people experiencing trauma, herbal treatments for anxiety or depression that actually had psychoactive effects. They also practiced preventive medicine hygiene practices that reduced disease, dietary practices that maintained health, regular physical activity that kept bodies strong, social practices that supported mental health prevention was probably easier than treatment, so maintaining health was emphasized. Their understanding of human anatomy was detailed. They butchered animals constantly, which taught them about muscles, organs, blood vessels, bones. They recognized that human anatomy was similar. They knew where major blood vessels were and how to avoid or compress them. They knew which organs were vital and which injuries were survivable. This knowledge informed their medical practices and their combat techniques. Let me tell you about their social structures in greater depth. These weren't anarchistic groups with no organization. They had clear social structures, leadership patterns, and decision-making processes. But these structures were more egalitarian than later agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherer groups couldn't support the hierarchies that came with agriculture and settled life. Leadership was situational and merit-based. The best hunter might lead hunting expeditions. The most knowledgeable plant gatherer might lead gathering trips. The wisest elder might lead council discussions. The best warrior might lead in conflicts. Leadership shifted based on context and demonstrated ability. This prevented accumulation of power and encouraged development of multiple skills. Decisions affecting the whole group were made collectively. Everyone had voice. Discussions continued until consensus emerged. This wasn't voting in the modern sense. It was talking through issues until everyone agreed on the best course. This process could be lengthy, but it ensured buy-in from all members. Decisions made collectively were supported collectively. Status existed but was earned and could be lost. A skilled hunter had high status. An excellent toolmaker was respected. A wise elder was honored. But status didn't translate into authority over others. You couldn't command people. You could only influence through respect and persuasion. This limited the abuse of status and kept societies relatively egalitarian. egalitarian. Gender relations were probably more equal than in later societies. Women weren't property or subordinate. They had crucial knowledge and skills. They controlled important resources. Archaeological evidence and studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest relatively gender-egalitarian social structures. Both men and women made important decisions. Both had specialized knowledge. Both contributed essentially to survival. There was division of labor by gender, but it wasn't rigid. Men typically did more hunting of large game. Women typically did more gathering and childcare. But there were exceptions. Some women hunted, some men specialized in gathering or childcare. Individuals did what they were good at and what needed doing. Elders had special status based on knowledge and experience. They'd lived longer, seen more, accumulated more wisdom. They remembered events from decades past. They knew solutions to rare problems. They provided perspective and guidance. Respecting elders wasn't just tradition, it was practical. Their knowledge was valuable. Children were valued for their future potential. They represented the continuation of the group. Their education was investment in the future. Mistreating children harmed the group's future prospects. So children were generally treated well, educated carefully, and integrated into community life. The disabled and elderly were supported when possible. Archaeological evidence shows individuals with severe disabilities who lived to adulthood, meaning they were cared for by others. Elderly individuals who could no longer contribute labor were still fed and sheltered. This wasn't unlimited altruism. Groups couldn't support many non-productive members, but they helped who they could, when they could. This creates a picture of daily life that's radically different from our stereotypes. These weren't brutal, primitive people barely surviving in a harsh world. They were sophisticated humans living complex, meaningful lives. They worked hard, but they weren't working all the time. They faced challenges, but they had skills and knowledge to meet those challenges. They lived with risk, but they managed risk effectively. Their lives had meaning and purpose that many modern people lack. Every individual had clear roles and responsibilities. Every skill developed had obvious value. Every day presented challenges that engaged their full capabilities. They weren't cogs in enormous systems they didn't understand. They were complete human beings living integrated lives where everything made sense. So yeah, that was life for the average caveman. Not grunting and club dragging, not primitive and helpless, not brutal and short. It was sophisticated, meaningful, and fully human. They were masters of their environment, experts in survival, artists and musicians, storytellers and innovators, loving parents and loyal community members, brave explorers and brilliant problem solvers. They were everything we are, everything we aspire to be, but doing it with nothing but stone tools and their own remarkable capabilities, and understanding their lives, really understanding what they accomplished and how they lived. That's not just interesting history, it's a mirror that shows us who we really are, what we're really capable of, what it really means to be human. And that's something worth knowing, something worth remembering, something worth carrying with us as we face our own challenges in our own time, because the blood of champions flows in your veins. The wisdom of survivors lives in your brain, and the spirit of those incredible cavemen still burns in your heart. You just have to remember it's there.